Putin can fit very well within this paradigm, both in terms of the fact that he makes the decisions. If you want to go back to the most stunning moment right before the invasion, it's Putin's public press conference, or with his government officials, who clearly don't want to invade Ukraine. These are high functionaries in the state. The bureaucracy is very uneasy about this. And Putin publicly humiliates them. And basically they crack. On TV you could see these people cracking. He's going to have the invasion. That's what I mean. Ultimately we talk about, is it a bureaucracy? I don't think the Russian bureaucracy wanted to invade Ukraine. Vladimir Putin wanted to invade Ukraine. And why does Putin do it? What's his early war experience? It's the Cold War. He's a KGB agent. He is trying to put together a new version of the Soviet Union. And he refers to it. Or Imperial Russia. This comes from his early experiences. So he is trying to relive or recreate what he understands is the proper paradigm by steamrolling his system.
So given how early, 2002, Putin begins to telegraph that ambition, what does it say about all of us as Western strategists that it takes so long to realize that and to take action?
By the way, I think this is the moment to quote George W. Bush saying, I looked deeply into his soul. Yeah. And John McCain said, I looked deeply into his soul and I saw 3 letters, KGB.
Yeah. It's quite simply that the United States was so secure it didn't really want to worry. I mean, I think that explains a lot about the relationship with Russia. Yeah. That they just didn't feel they had a security issue in Europe, or a really big one. They didn't want a crisis if they didn't want to, so they would always try to put it off. Well, Crimea. Well, Donbass.
But see, I guess here, in a way, I think this speaks more, in a way, Corey, to your point about ideology, and about belief systems, which seem to us irrational. That believing that you can reconstruct the Russian Empire. I mean, he doesn't want to reconstruct the Soviet Union. He does want to reconstruct some version of the Russian Empire. We find it very hard to wrap our head around the idea that, you can have people who are the leaders of major countries who are perfectly comfortable risking a very, very large war with all that entails because of an objective which strikes us as irrational. So, I mean, what is so interesting in retrospect about, so many interesting things about the pre-war crisis is the knots into which highly intelligent observers in the United States and Europe tie themselves in order to convince themselves, well, this all has to do with how we handled NATO expansion. Yep. Or, I mean, wasn't NATO expanding? It's countries wanting to get into NATO, which is actually a very different thing.
Desperately clawing their way into security.
Because they understood Russia better than we did. And, that, I think, is one of the lessons. You can have people out there who are making consequential strategic choices who have value systems utterly at odds with ours, and you can't talk them out of it. And you can't bargain them out of it. I mean, you can think about a lot of things, including our Iran policy, for example.
So to connect the strategists to Ukraine, this business about risk tolerance and intolerance, I think is the defining characteristic of American strategy since the invasion. Yep. And an anxiety that allows Russia to make incredibly dangerous statements that intimidate us when we're actually the strong ones in this equation. We have talked ourselves into passivity. How would the strategists of your excellent book, what would they do differently?
The good guys, that is.
At least the good guys. We know what the bad guys would do.
We're not particularly interested. What would Mussolini do about Vladimir Putin?
I mean, I don't know. It is interesting. They've been talking about leadership and experience, that Biden is clearly also influenced by the Cold War. And Biden was actually a dove in the Cold War. And he was a believer, and he was worried about Soviet escalation in the Cold War. And that seems to have translated over. What would the strategists we know have done in the Cold War? I think they would have both, if both the Democratic ones, be they Churchill and Roosevelt, have been more hardline sooner. It's not to say to begin with they would have been that different.
Yeah.
I think that they both would have, because they both would have been heavily influenced, I think, like Biden was, by the reports that Ukraine had no chance. And therefore, they wouldn't have been throwing everything into Ukraine if the idea was Ukraine wasn't going to survive. I think both of them, however, would have understood this was a situation, as Elliot said, where Russia has shown itself to be very weak and deferring to it, as the United States is constantly deferring to Russia, actually, in its treatment of Ukraine. I can't believe either of them would be doing it 2.5 years after the invasion occurred. And that would be the difference.
No, and I think, you know, to say certainly in the case of Churchill,